Hey dude, I have been dying to get this episode to you. In fact, this conversation is so huge and so important that I've actually split it into 2 episodes. I'm assuming you've heard of Ozempic. In case you've been under a rock, Ozempic is a new class of weight loss drug that is delivering astonishing results. And I know, we've all been here before. There is many a precedent for a new miracle weight loss cure that ends up being a flash in the pan, and the obesity epidemic marches ever onward. As my guest today will explain, this is a whole new game. Johann Hari is the author of Magic Pill, The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs. Johann also writes for the New York Times, The Guardian, and Le Monde. He is the New York Times best-selling author of Chasing the Scream, Lost Connections, and Stolen Focus. His TED Talks have been viewed over 70 million times, and his work has been praised by a broad range of people, from Oprah Winfrey to Noam Chomsky to Joe Rogan. He's going to explain to us why these drugs might change our world as much as the cell phone. And by that, he means there have already been economic and social impacts that are only just going to get bigger, as it's estimated that half of North Americans will be on these drugs in 10 years. So even if you think you have zero interest in Ozempic, as I did, to be honest, before I read this book, this episode is actually more about the future of public health, with a whole lot of ripple effects that will affect us all. You are definitely going to want to hear this.
Ready to break up with your bullshit? I mean, all those excuses that are keeping you stuck. Because you have one life to live. And if you're not having fun yet, then that's a problem, dude. Welcome to Goals, Grit, and Some Woo-Woo Shit. The podcast where you learn about the habits of kicking ass at life. Whether you want to get ripped, get rich, or just get high on life, this is the place to be. Here's your host, best-selling author and feel-good expert, Una Duncan.
Johann Hari, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I am so excited to talk to you about your book, Magic Pill, because I loved it so much. And you know what, Johann, I went into it thinking I had no interest in Ozempic at all. I was like, whatever, that has nothing to do with me. And you present the case, and I don't know if this is your quote or someone else's, but you present the idea that this classification of weight loss drugs is actually going to change the world as much as the cell phone. Can you explain why that might be the case?
You know, it's even more amazing when you remember where that comes from. So Barclays Bank commissioned a very sober-minded financial analyst called Emily Field to look into these new weight loss drugs to guide their future investment decisions. Obviously, they're making a lot of investment decisions the whole time. And so they asked us to look into it. So, you know, will this have any implications for where we should invest, where we should not invest? And she came back and said, if you want a comparison for how big an effect this is going to have, you've got to look at the invention of the smartphone. And when you first hear that, you think, well, that sounds way over the top, right? But when you actually look at the evidence, as these kind of very sober financial analysts did, you begin to see why. So the first thing I think people need to know is, you know, when you first hear about this, you think, oh, we've had diet drugs before. This is a fad. This is a craze. It's really important to understand this is not a fad. This is not a craze. This is an extraordinary scientific breakthrough. Scientists have cracked the code of what regulates human appetite. It's gut hormones. We'll come back to what that means, I'm sure. And as a result, they've developed drugs that have a staggering effect on weight loss. The average person who uses Ozempic or Wegovy loses 15% of their body weight within a year. The average person who uses Mounjaro, which is the next in this class of drugs, loses 21% of their body weight. And for the next class of drugs after that, Triple G, which will probably be available next year, the average person loses 24% of their body weight. So this is a staggering moment.
Yeah, there's
right?
no diet that's done anything like this ever.
Nothing. Like, I mean, the Triple G is only slightly below bariatric surgery in its effect, right?
So you're saying the Barclays was saying this is going to change as much as the cell phone because this is a whole new thing. Tell us a little bit about the ripple effects. So this is a whole new weight loss thing. Okay, great. But what are the ripple effects that, for example, Barclays Bank would be interested in?
Well, the economic effects are absolutely enormous. If you think about how much of the economy is food, and how much of the economy is related to the illnesses that are caused by or made worse by obesity, and you think about how much all of that is about to be shaken up, you begin to get some sense of this. You know, the book is called Magic Pill because there's 3 ways these drugs could be magic. I realized as I spent, you know, a lot of time researching this, traveling all over the world from, you know, Iceland to Minneapolis to Okinawa to interview the leading experts on this. The biggest defenders, the biggest critics, people in between. What I kind of realized is, the first way it could be like magic is the most obvious. It could just solve the problem of obesity, right? So while researching the book, I took Ozempic. I lost a huge amount of weight. I lost 42 pounds in a year. My whole life I've overeaten. I started to inject myself once a week in the leg, tiny little scratch, and now I don't overeat, and I've lost a huge amount of weight. There are days when it feels like just magic. The second way it could be magic is much more disturbing. It could be a magic trick. It could be like a conjurer who shows you a card trick while picking a pocket. I go through in the book, the subtitle is The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs. There are extraordinary benefits I'm sure we're going to talk about, but I also learned that there are 12 disturbing risks associated with these drugs. It could be that over time, these 12 risks will outweigh those benefits, in which case it will be a trick in the worst sense. The third way it could be magic, though, I actually think is the most likely. Think about the stories of magic that we grew up with when we were kids. What would be a good example? Think about Aladdin, right? You find the lamp, you rub it, the genie appears, the genie grants your wish, and your wish comes true, but never quite in the way you expected. The magic starts to run away from you in all sorts of unpredictable ways. We're already seeing that, and along with extraordinary benefits for many people with obesity, we're seeing all sorts of unpredictable effects. No one who designed these drugs, for example, intended them for them to be used by young girls with eating disorders who are using these drugs to starve themselves to death, for example. So there's a lot that I'm really worried about here, as well as a lot I'm really excited about. So I think this will sound over the top until we dig into it more, but the way I started to think about these drugs is they're a tool like fire, right? They're just this unbelievably powerful tool. Fire is a great tool if I use it to warm my house. It's a really bad tool if I use it to burn down your house, right? And the truth is, this is so powerful, it's going to have both positive and negative effects, which we're already seeing. Obviously, we're seeing huge weight loss, huge gains in health for many people, but also just think about the economic things. Krispy Kreme stocks absolutely tanked late last year, right? Experts said because of these drugs. Think about all sorts of unpredictable things. There's a company that makes the hip joint, the hinges for knee and hip replacements, right? Their stock is right down because far fewer people are going to need knee and hip replacements pretty soon, because the main driver of hip and knee replacements is obesity. Jefferies Financial just did a really big report for the American airlines saying they're going to have to spend a lot less on jet fuel pretty soon because it takes so much less jet fuel to fly a much thinner population. Even in LA, there's been a huge run on jewelers because so many people in LA are taking Ozempic that their fingers have shrunk and their wedding rings don't fit them anymore. Loads of people are having to have their wedding bands refitted. So there's huge and unpredictable consequences here in every direction.
Wow. Okay. I want to dig so much into all of that. But first, I just want to take you back to your own personal story.
Sure.
So you said you started taking Ozempic. What came first, that you wanted to experiment with it because you were researching it, or did you start researching it because you were personally using it and you said, I want to know what I'm putting in my body?
It's a bit of both. I remember so clearly when I first learned about the existence of these drugs, really quickly, I had two totally contradictory thoughts in my mind. The first thing I thought was, well, this could save my life. I was about to turn 44. My grandfather died when he was 44 of a massive heart attack. Loads of the men in my family are obese and have heart problems. My dad had terrible heart problems. My uncle died of a heart attack. And I had been obese most of my adult life. And I thought, well, if we really do have a drug that reduces or even reverses obesity, that's going to have huge health implications, because we know that obesity causes or makes worse over 200 known diseases or complications. So right away, I was like, whoa, this is big, potentially. But I also thought, wait a minute, this sounds way too good to be true. All previous diet drugs have promised huge gains in health, but have actually in the end screwed you up and had to be withdrawn from the market. Can you really have something when it comes to health that's a kind of free lunch? I guess with Ozempic, it would be a smaller free lunch because you don't want to eat. But so I really immediately felt an intense attraction to this and an extreme wariness of it. And really a lot of the journey I then went on was about exploring, well, which of those instincts turn out to be right.
Do you feel like you got to the bottom of that, or just it's a deeper hole than you ever imagined?
I did come to some conclusions, although I still feel very conflicted, because the truth is the picture here is genuinely complicated, and anyone listening, who's obese or overweight, and that is a majority of Canadians, just like it's a majority of British people, has to weigh really two things here: the risks of obesity and the risks of these drugs, right? And the answer is not obvious. The more obese you are, the greater the risk. So obviously that becomes a bigger risk to weigh against the risk of these drugs. But what I really hope the book is a kind of guide so people can think through for themselves, okay, which of these risks of obesity apply to me? Which of these risks of the drugs apply to me? How do I think this through? What risk do I want to take? Of course, if you can lose weight through diet and exercise, that doesn't incur these risks, by all means try it. I've never met a fat person who hasn't tried diet and exercise, but if you never tried it, by all means, knock yourself out. I strongly recommend it. And it does work for a small minority of people. It's important to stress that, and it's always worth trying that first. But for the majority of people for whom it doesn't work, and I explain why in the book, and we can talk about that as well, but for the majority for whom it doesn't work, that's because of the environment we're living in. It's not your fault. It's not that you're a failure. It's because of a really big change that's happened in your lifetime and my lifetime that I can also talk about. We're in a kind of trap, and these drugs are a kind of trapdoor. They're a risky, rusty trapdoor, to be sure. I'm not totally confident I've been right to go through that trapdoor, because I experienced many benefits and some really big drawbacks. But I do think this is coming for us. 47% of Americans want to take these drugs, and that's even before, very soon there'll be a daily pill. There'll be $1 a day. I predict that more than half of Canadians will be taking these drugs 10 years from now. And we really need to take a beat and think about what that's going to mean for all of us, the positives, the negatives, what it'll mean for the culture, what it'll mean for the way we think about our bodies, our health, the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about food. It's going to have enormous implications and consequences for us. So I hope the book is a chance for us to really begin to think that through, and how it's going to change how we feel about ourselves. Right.
So make some individual decisions about ourselves and what we might choose, but also to realize how this is going to impact broader society. Yeah. So I want to talk about a little bit, some assumptions right off the top. Like, in order to tackle this subject, you had to deal with the idea of health at any size. And so where did you land with that? Can you talk about that?
I'm strongly in favor of body positivity. We want everyone to feel good about their bodies, and we don't want anyone to be shamed or stigmatized. Stigma is a form of cruelty and bullying. And I wondered if these drugs were a kind of betrayal of that, right? And there was a person who really helped me to think this through, an amazing woman called Shelley Bovey. She's now 76. When I was, I think you're a little bit younger than me, but when I was a kid, the only time you saw fat people on television, particularly fat women, was as the butt of a joke, right? It was just tremendous cruelty towards them. And the first person I ever heard challenging that was Shelley Bovey. So I was, I think, 10 years old when her first book came out, and I saw her on television. So Shelley wrote the first book to ever argue for body positivity or fat pride, different terms, in Britain. She introduced the concept to Britain, really. And I went and tracked her down. And her story, I think, is really important. She really clarified a lot of this for me. So Shelley grew up in a town called Port Talbot. It's a kind of working class, kind of industrial town in Wales. Fort McMurray would be a fairly good comparison point in Canada.
Thank you for the translation.
And she was, this was the 60s, she was, as she would put it, the only fat girl in her school. And one day when she was 11, she was in the classroom and her teacher said, "Bovey, stay behind after class. I need to talk to you." She was sitting there thinking, what have I done wrong? And the teacher said, "You're much too fat. It's disgusting. Go and see the school nurse. She'll sort you out." So completely thrown and shaken, she went to the school nurse. And the school nurse said, "Why are you here?" She said, "Well, my teacher says I'm too fat." She said, "Take off your clothes. I'm going to inspect you." And the nurse looked at her and said, "It's disgusting," and just berated her and said, "You're a pig. Stop eating." And Shelley left really kind of shaken. And she was constantly soaking up this kind of abuse. Other girls saying to her, "You're disgusting. Thank God I'm not like you." The other teachers saying this to her. It was just her whole life. And, she was really smart. She was advised to apply to Cambridge, which was a really big deal for a working class girl then, as it would be now. And she was just like, I'll just be humiliated. I can't do this, right? She got an offer for a place at a good university. She's just like, I can't go. They're just going to bully me. They're going to shame me. And all through her life, she's just soaking up this abuse. When she got pregnant and went to the doctor, the first thing the doctor said to her was, well, you shouldn't be pregnant when you're as fat as you are. She had a very difficult birth, and she was lying there covered in blood after the birth, and the midwife looked at her and said, you really need to lose some weight. When her baby wouldn't attach properly, he wasn't feeding, she took him to the doctor, and the doctor said, what are you trying to do? Make the baby as fat as you are? So just this constant, 42% of women with a BMI higher than 35 are insulted every single day, right? So Shelley's experience was not unusual. And then one day she learned that there was this movement in the United States that just said, we don't have to take this. We don't have to accept this abuse. This is just a form of cruelty and stigma, and we're not going to take it. And Shelley became a great champion of this in Britain and remains really proud of the work she did. Among the other things she proved and pointed to a lot of the scientific evidence towards is that even on its own terms, stigma doesn't work. Stigma actually makes the problem worse. That when you stigmatize people, they actually feel more humiliated. They comfort eat more, which makes them gain weight. Also, Lindy West, a really good body positivity advocate, put it really well when she said, I'm paraphrasing, but she said, why do we think making people hate their bodies will make them treat their bodies better? You don't take good care of a thing you hate, right? And Shelley was made to hate her body so much that she told me she'd never even looked at her body naked, right? Even in the shower, she wouldn't look down. She would wash, but she wouldn't look down. So Shelley became this great champion of body positivity and remains incredibly proud of the work she did on that. And her book became something of a hit in the early 90s. But then something else happened to Shelley. She was just turning 50 and she was very obese and she was losing the ability to walk. And her doctor told her she was having heart problems because of her weight. And she looked at the science and she knew that obesity does make it much more likely you will develop all sorts of really serious health problems. Pretty much all the things we fear, from cancer to dementia to diabetes to heart disease, are made much more likely by being obese. They're not guaranteed, of course, there are exceptions, but they're made much more likely. And she felt a real dilemma because she was like, well, if I talk about this or if I try to lose weight, am I betraying everything I've said? Am I giving in to stigma? But when she really thought about it, she thought, well, why do we pose it as either or? Either you're against stigma or you're in favour of reducing obesity where it's possible. She said, surely it's both and, right? Surely you should be opposed to stigma and you should be opposed to things that harm people's health, right? Where possible. So she went to a weight loss program. She lost a lot of weight. She's the first person to point out that it's very hard to lose weight just through dieting. She's in the minority, but it did succeed. And her health massively improved. Her heart problems went away. She went from barely being able to walk to being able to run. Her life got much better. And she said, I can't tell people that my life isn't better when I can run and my heart isn't getting diseased, right? And to me, I think Shelley really helped us to see there'll be lots of people listening who love someone who's obese and are almost certain that you want to protect them from two things. You want to protect them from being bullied and stigmatized, and you want to protect them from getting heart disease, cancer, dementia, diabetes, all the things that are made much more likely by being obese. And I don't think there's any contradiction in being opposed to those two things. Mm-hmm. They're both forms of love.
Sure. It's like if someone's in a wheelchair, they don't deserve to be stigmatized for being in a wheelchair. And yet you're also like, if we can get you out of that, that would be a great idea.
Yeah. And we have seatbelts because we don't want people to be horribly injured in car accidents so that they end up in a wheelchair, right? Yeah. Doesn't mean that we think people in wheelchairs are worth less than anyone else. Mm-hmm, of course we don't. But it does mean we acknowledge that there is a difference, and if you can avoid that difference, it's better to do so.
Have you seen the South Park special on obesity?
Yeah, I literally watched it 2 nights ago. Yeah,
I just watched it last night, Kate. So one of my favorite lines in it is when, so for listeners, a character qualifies for Ozempic, but he can't afford it, and then the doctor writes him a prescription. And he said, "What's this?" And he says, "Oh, it's a prescription for Lizzo. Rich people get Ozempic, poor people get body positivity."
Exactly. I think there's a lot of truth in that. And it's not to say there isn't, I don't actually think there's a tension between Ozempic and body positivity. I mean, there's a small part of the body positivity movement, and it's not the majority, who argue that obesity doesn't harm your health, that that's a myth. And I'm afraid, I looked at that in an open-minded way. The scientific evidence is absolutely overwhelming that that's not true. That does not support that. I mean, it's one of the most robust findings in the whole of science is that obesity on average harms health. Of course, there are exceptions. My mother smokes 70 cigarettes a day. That she's alive and well. She's 78, but that doesn't mean that that smoking doesn't cause lung cancer. It just means my mother's the exception, right?
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. So given that, so now we know Ozempic and this classification of drugs will massively reduce obesity. Obesity is bad for our health. So what are some of the other pros of this classification of drugs? Let's get into the pros and cons. This episode is brought to you by the Masters of Fitness Awesomeness program. Here's someone who wants to tell you what that is.
I've been in the MFA about 6 months, and it's been a truly transformative experience for me. And over the last 6 months, I really feel that I've recovered my sense of myself as an active person, and that change in my life. I really seeing all of these amazing people working on the same project that I am, which is to take good care of myself so I can live a kick-ass life, has really been inspiring. And the guidance and support that I've gotten from the team has not only helped me to lose weight and feel better in my joints and improve my PMS symptoms, but also improve my inner monologue so that I'm not as harsh on myself, so that I don't believe my own BS as much and reach out for help when I need help, because it's there. This team is really there for you when you need them. I say give it a try, invest in yourself, and see what you can do.
I'm slightly embarrassed to answer this because the answer sounds really dumb. The thing that most shocked me in the research for my book is something I thought I'd known since I was a little boy. I guess at any point since I was, 7, if you'd asked me, is obesity bad for your health? I would have said, well, yeah. I was stunned by the scientific evidence about how bad for you obesity is for your health. I didn't know that it made you much more likely to get dementia and much more likely to get cancer. I mean, I did know about heart disease. Obviously, that's something very close to my heart, literally. But I even think about something that I'm really embarrassed to say this. So I knew that obesity makes you much more likely to get type 2 diabetes, right? In fact, if you're obese when you're 18, you have a 70% chance of getting type 2 diabetes in your lifetime. But I thought, well, if you live in a country like Canada or Britain where we've got good healthcare, you get given insulin, you're basically fine, right? A type 2 diabetic plus insulin is like you or me, right? That's not true at all. From interviewing the leading experts on diabetes here in Britain and the United States and looking at the scientific evidence in a lot of detail, I mean, I was stunned. Type 2 diabetes knocks 15 years off your life on average. It's the biggest preventable cause of blindness in the developed world. More Americans have to have a limb or extremity amputated every year because of diabetes than because they got shot. And you will have noticed a lot of Americans get shot. In fact, I interviewed a leading doctor in Britain who treats diabetics, Dr. Max Pemberton. And he said to me something that sounds unbelievably shocking when you first hear it. But when you look at the evidence, you see why he says it. He said, if you gave me a choice between becoming HIV positive and becoming diabetic, type 2 diabetes, I would choose to become HIV positive. Because if you're HIV positive and you get medical treatment, you live as long as everyone else. That is absolutely not the case with diabetes, right? And that's just one of the 200 negative effects of obesity. So what we know is when you reverse obesity, you massively reverse all of those medical conditions. So one of the best ways of thinking about that, because these drugs have only existed for a couple of years, one of the best ways of looking at that is actually look at a parallel area of science, which is bariatric surgery. So bariatric surgery, for people who don't know, is obviously the surgery you have when you're obese there are lots of different kinds of it, but things like stomach stapling, gastric bands that, make it very hard or impossible for you to continue to overeat, and therefore you lose lots of weight. And what do we know about bariatric surgery? So we know that it's a horrible, grim operation. We know that 1 in 1,000 people dies in the operation. It's no joke. But the reason people put themselves through that is because when you massively reduce obesity, the benefits to your health are stunning. If you have bariatric surgery in the 7 years that follow, you are 56% less likely to die of a heart attack. You are 60% less likely to die of cancer. You are 92% less likely to die of diabetes-related causes. In fact, it's so good for your health, you're 40% less likely to die at all in those 7 years after the surgery, right? And we now know that these drugs bring similar benefits. So obviously, people who have bariatric surgery are very obese, so that somewhat skews the figures, but we know now, so it's a lower bar for getting Ozempic, Wegovy, and the other drugs. But we know that if, for example, if you take these drugs and you start with a BMI higher than 27, as I did, your chance of having a heart attack or stroke in the next 2 years goes down by 20%, which is an extraordinary reduction, right? That would save more than 1 million lives in the United States across a decade. So, and we're seeing lots of really, really positive effects now. So along with some significant risks. So yeah, the benefit is really clear. Obesity screws your health. If you reduce your obesity or you reverse it entirely, and many people, it reverses it entirely, as it has for me, it massively boosts your health. And even just things like my back doesn't hurt anymore, right? I had back pain for years. Within 2 months, I lost 42 pounds on Ozempic in a year, but within like 2 months, my back pain went away. I sleep so much better, right? Like your quality of life just dramatically improves if you start from obese or overweight. Obviously, it's very different if you start from a healthy weight and you take these drugs to get down to super skinny. That actually incurs risk. We can talk about that later. But yeah, so that the benefit is that, and it is overwhelming.
Maybe before we talk about the other pros, because there were some other pros that really blew my mind, maybe just a quick, paragraph or two about exactly how these drugs work. It's an injection. Yes. You take it in your belly, I think, and then it causes a hormone that makes you 100% not interested in food. Is that true?
I wish I had known that you do not have to inject it into your belly, because there's something about, so I'm a total needle phobe. So for ages I was put off these drugs where I could not inject myself once a week. It's a tiny little EpiPen. It's like a scratch. You barely feel it. But at first I was told, I read online that you have to inject it in your stomach. And I thought, the idea of sticking a needle into your stomach seems horrific to me. And then actually you can inject it into your leg as well, which seems much less intimate to me. I don't know why. So you inject it in my case, I inject it in my leg once a week, tiny scratch. You barely feel it. So we know lots of things about how it works, and there's some things we don't know. But if you ate something now, Una, it doesn't matter what it is, after a little while, your pancreas will produce a hormone called GLP-1. And GLP-1 is just part of your body's natural signals going, hey, Una, you had enough. Stop eating, right? It's the brakes, basically. But natural GLP-1 only stays around in your system for a couple of minutes, and then it's washed away. What these drugs do is they inject you with an artificial copy of GLP-1 that, instead of being washed away in a few minutes, stays around in your system for a whole week, which has this bizarre effect. I'll never forget, the second day after I started taking Ozempic, I went to a diner just up the street from where I live when I'm in London. And I ordered what I used to order for breakfast every morning. I'm slightly embarrassed to say. It's a massive chicken sandwich with loads of mayo in it. And I would have that, I would wolf it down, and I would still want like potato chips. And I went in, I ordered it, and I had like 4 mouthfuls, and I was full. I just didn't want any more. It was bizarre. And that was what it was like from then on. It was like shutters had come down on my appetite. I was just very full, very fast, and I didn't want to eat very much. So it's not like you're hungry and you're denying yourself. Mm-hmm. You just don't want to eat that much, and you feel full very quickly when you do.
The thing that's so interesting to me is that people are all of a sudden not interested in food and also don't have all the food chatter. So I have a friend who is on Ozempic right now, and she said that previously her whole like her whole day, she would sit there and she would think work, work, work. And then she'd think fat, 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 you're fat, and planning out her meals and, thinking about when do I get a snack? How many calories is that going to be? Like, so many people are living with that. And she said it just shut off all of that noise. And so I'm wondering, did you have a similar experience with that, the mind chatter?
What you're describing is a very, very common experience. I didn't have that problem. I actually wasn't obsessed with food. I had a different relationship with food to that. I realized that I actually realize now I don't think I even particularly liked food when I was obese. I think I was using food to calm myself down and comfort eat much more than I was out of a kind of obsessive thinking about the pleasures of food or a relationship with food that was based on the feeling you get when, the feeling of consuming it. A lot of people do, but you're describing a very, very common experience. And we know these drugs, so initially it was thought these drugs primarily work on your gut, right? It's a gut hormone, it's gut's made in the pancreas, it's working mainly on your gut. But we now know from interviewing the cutting edge neuroscientists, as I did, that these drugs in fact are predominantly working on your brain. You have GLP-1 receptors, not just in your gut, but in your brain. And they're predominantly working on your brain and they're changing how you think and feel. There's a big debate about how they're changing how you think and feel. We can go into that. But yeah, and lots of people are describing it's a profound effect on their mental experience, their psychological experience, as much as it is a gut effect.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing I don't understand, when she describes to me how little she eats now, I'm thinking, God, that sounds like 1,000 calories a day or something. But I don't hear low energy or malnutrition being one of the side effects that people are reporting. If you're eating so little.
No, malnutrition is one of the 12
is it? Okay,
significant risks that I go through in the book. And malnutrition is a really big risk. So if she's eating 1,000 calories a day, she will definitely get malnutrition, and she's taking too high a dose and she needs to cut back in consultation with her doctor. That's really alarming. I mean, people in Auschwitz were given 800 calories a day, so she really should not be on 1,000 calories a day.
But that's the kind of thing that can happen. People just are not interested in food, really, right?
Yeah, there's a big issue going on with dosing, right? Mm-hmm, I should re-say that. There's a big issue going on with dosing. So yeah, this happened to a close relative of mine. She was taking it and she just was forgetting to eat, and her kids were having to remind her to eat. And malnutrition is a terrible problem. It's disastrous for your health. And I'm worried that lots of people seem to be exhibiting that. It's why some doctors are now prescribing the drug along with a minimum number of calories that the person should consume in a day. So yeah, I think there's an issue. Definitely, if your calorie intake is going too low, you're taking too high a dose of the drug.
Got it. But one of the other pros that I understand is that your cravings for other things are also going down. Like for alcohol or, overconsumption of shopping, gambling, like all of these kind of, addictive kind of things are being suppressed. Isn't that true?
Of all the things that I write about in my book, Magic Pill, this is the one about which there's a big grey area. There's a lot of grey in this subject, but so there's some things we know for sure. With animals like rats, if you get them to use a lot of alcohol or cocaine or heroin, I don't know why I always find it particularly funny to picture rats using cocaine, but I do. You get them to use it habitually over a long period of time, and then you give them these GLP-1 drugs, they massively reduce the amount they use. And I interviewed the teams of scientists all over the world who've done this. So that's really striking. And there's no other drug that causes a reduction in all of the different classes of drugs, right? It's not just that you drink less alcohol, but you use less fentanyl, you use less heroin, you use less cocaine, you use fewer stimulants. That's really striking finding in the animal studies. And it's a really big effect. It's usually about a 50% reduction in the heaviest users. The other thing we know, and this is anecdotal, that the bit I've just described is heavy, hard science by very good scientists. The other thing we know is that anecdotally, lots of people taking these drugs are reporting something that sounds fairly similar. For example, I interviewed a Canadian social worker called Michelle, who she'd had a bad breakup. In the wake of the breakup, she'd started obsessively shopping online. Like, she was buying hundreds of books she'd never read, like clothes she'd never wear. I mean, like huge amounts of money, the equivalent of her mortgage payment. And then she started taking Ozempic, and this compulsive shopping just went away. We have very little evidence on humans yet, and I think we should be cautious about this. What we know, there've been some very small studies. One found it did reduce alcohol use in the heaviest alcohol consumers. Another found that it did reduce smoking, but only if you paired it with a nicotine patch. But there's loads of studies going on, and we'll know much more now. The most optimistic reading of these drugs, and I want to stress this is speculative, the most optimistic reading of these drugs is that they're actually not an appetite regulating drug. They're a self-control drug, that they boost self-regulation and self-control across the board. We don't know that. I don't know if that'll turn out to be the case. There are some scientists who are optimistic it could be, and some who think that's way overblown. We'll find out soon. But that's a really interesting area of emerging science.
Wow. Okay, so in the peachiest case scenario, in the future, everyone's skinny and no one has addictions. What is the worst case scenario? What are some of the cons of these drugs that people might not understand? When they hear that, they're like, "Sign me up! I'm down for that." What might they need to know?
Well, some of the cons are already coming to pass. So I experienced some of them. So I'll go through 12 in the book, but I'll start with one. Something weird happened to me when I was taking the drugs. I was getting what I wanted. For the first 6 months or so, I was thinking, this is really weird. I'm getting what I wanted. I'm losing loads of weight. All sorts of good things flowed from that. You know, like I say, my back pain went away. I could feel I was healthier. My neighbour's hot gardener hit on me. Loads of good things happened.
That's good.
But I didn't feel better emotionally. Actually, I felt slightly worse. And I was becoming aware that there were some scientists, although I stress this is highly contested, there were some scientists who were concerned these drugs may be causing depression or even suicidal feelings in a minority of people who use them. Although some other scientists disagree. The FDA does have a warning about this in the US. And I was not depressed or suicidal, but I wondered if there could be some connection between the fact I was feeling kind of muted and down. And so I looked into this a lot. Now, it could be, like I say, we know these drugs primarily affect the brain. It could be this is a brain effect. There are some serious scientists who are concerned about that. But I suspect for me, and for many people, it was something much more simple, and it's something I wish I'd been aware of in advance.
Like people were eating their feelings, and then all of a sudden they don't have that coping mechanism. They're left with their feelings.
Well, I had a real epiphany about it. It was in a branch of KFC in Vegas. My nephew said to me the other day, "It's weird how many of your epiphanies in life seem to have happened in a branch of KFC." I was like, that's a good point. But it was
like a church.
Exactly, it's the closest I get to it. It was about 7 months into taking the drugs. I was in Vegas, where I spent a lot of my time. I was researching the murder of someone that I knew and really loved. It's something I've been reporting on for a long time, and it'll be the subject of my next book. So as you can imagine, that was a very emotionally wrenching thing. And one day on autopilot, I went to a branch of KFC I've been to 1,000 times. If anyone is listening in Vegas or knows Vegas, it's the one on West Sahara, which is one of the skeeziest KFCs in the whole world. And believe me, that is saying something. And I've been to all the KFCs. And I went in and I ordered what I would have ordered before I was taking Ozempic. I ordered a bucket of fried chicken. And I ate the first chicken drumstick. And I looked at the bucket and I thought, shit, I can't eat this. If you try to overeat when you're on Ozempic, I haven't actually done it, but people who have tell me you just vomit, right? Imagine I came to you after you'd had like a massive Christmas dinner and I said, "Hey, Una, great news. I got you a KFC bucket," right? Like basically that's how you feel on Ozempic pretty quickly, right? And I remember, it's so funny, like Colonel Sanders is on the wall of that KFC. And I remember it's like he was looking down at me going, "What happened to my best customer?" And I remember very consciously thinking, almost hearing it as if, sometimes you have a thought about in your own mind that's almost like an external voice. And I thought, oh, you're just going to have to feel bad, right? And it was this real moment of clarity for me, because in the book I go through the 5 reasons why we overeat. Sorry, say again. In the book, I go through the 5 reasons why we eat. Only one of them is like to nurture your body, to keep your body going, right? The rest are all psychological. And I realized for me, I grew up in a family where there was a lot of addiction and craziness. And from when I was very young, and I had some awareness of this before, but I didn't see it so clearly. From when I was very young, I would deal with, you don't have much control when you're a child, even in good circumstances. I would deal with that chaos by deliberately overeating, by actually stuffing myself. And that was really my relationship with food. I would eat to stuff myself. And I couldn't do that on Ozempic. What these drugs do is they interrupt your eating patterns. It's obviously a good thing. That's why you lose weight. But what that can do is bring to the surface some of the deep underlying reasons why you eat in the first place. Now, again, that can be a good thing, right? Clearly, there are better ways for me to deal with sadness than Colonel Sanders, right? But that can be a difficult and rocky transition. And I suspect that's what's happening with a lot of people. It's another thing we can learn from bariatric surgery. So we know that in addition to all the benefits that we talked about with bariatric surgery, after bariatric surgery, your suicide risk quadruples, right? It's a staggering increase in suicide. I think there's a lot of things going on there. I think also it's something that Professor Corel LaRue, who's worked on both bariatric surgery and these drugs, said to me is a lot of people who are overweight tell themselves, well, if only I could get down to a healthy weight, my life would be great, right? And then you lose your weight and your husband's still an asshole and you still hate your job. And actually, although you're better off in some ways, it's not this magic solution that you imagined it would be. So I think there's lots of complex psychological things going on there when people lose weight. And I wish I'd been prepared more for the psychological ramifications of it. Yeah, it's transition. That's the good word. Yeah.
Okay, dude, I am so sorry to leave you on a bit of a cliffhanger, but this conversation was so in depth that I had to split it into 2 episodes. Next week, you are going to hear more about the real risks of these drugs, who should consider them and who definitely shouldn't, what happens when you go off the drugs, and whether you can maintain the weight loss. We're also going to talk about the environment that's created the obesity crisis in the first place and how to nip this problem in the root without drugs. Until next week. Hey dude, thanks for listening. If you like this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you can get the next one. And by the way, if you rate and review this podcast, it really helps me get found by other people who need some goals, grit, and some woo-woo shit. And be sure to connect and DM me at Una Duncan on Instagram and let me know what you thought of the episode. Chat soon.